here. Margaret Zabinski, Nisi, it's good to have a mod in as well. Karina, Real Batman, Amy Hall. Have I left anyone out? I see a couple of you have voted. 25 votes. If you haven't voted, make sure that you do. But I see the what's the word? The overwhelming favorite is bipolar. So almost half of you think that Van Gogh was bipolar. And that is followed by about a third of you who think that it's none of those. So the question is, which mental disorder or mental illness did Vincent van Gogh have? Schizophrenia, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, I think. Some people have thought he could have had epilepsy. And I did put a link in there that discusses, could it have been this disorder, could it have been that one, and so on. What I want you to do is, while we are kind of going through the letters, so while we're going through today's letters, ask yourself that question. So while we're going through the letters, ask yourself which disorder is sort of coming through, right? So I'm going to ask you at the end of this episode what you think the answer is, right? Not there yet, good to see you. And then I'm also going to be repeating the question, almost kind of a rhetorical question, as we continue going through the letters. So I'm kind of going to be saying, these are the letters, these are his statements. Which mental illness do you think they showcase, or which one is sort of being emphasized? What is coming through loud and clear? What is coming into focus as we go, from one letter to the next, 1 year to the next? What is coming to the fore, right? Does that make sense? So I want you guys to think of that question specifically in this episode, but I'm going to be bringing it up as we go further through the timeline. Nisi says, can comorbidity be a choice? Yeah, it can be a choice. If you like. Is Stephanie not around? I'm not sure if there was something that she was going to be doing. I didn't really look at Instagram. Karina says, I'm not so well versed in mental illness. Well, I want you to look at the letters. I don't really want you to go and study up on mental illness. I want you to look at the letters and go, does this feel like someone who's got a screw loose, right? What is actually going on here? That's kind of what I want you to think about. Thanks, Nisi. Okay. Anyway, we're thinking about Steph, and we're also missing Bria. I see we had about 28 people. It's like a kind of a university class, so I'm not sure how long they'll stick around, but let's get going. So we're going to now deal with the transplantation of Van Gogh to Amsterdam, right? So if you recall, our story began in The Hague, then it went to London, then it went to Paris, I think. Then it went back to London. And then from London, it went to Dordrecht, which is where we are now. And then from Dordrecht to Amsterdam. And from Amsterdam, he's going to go to the Borinage. From the Borinage, I think he returns to Holland for a while, and from there to Paris, and then he spends the rest of his life in France. So quite an itinerant thing that is going on. Donna Rainey, good to see you here. Welcome. New member. Okay, so let's kick it off. March 22nd, 1877. And just to put you guys in the timeline, pleasure, Donna. By April, he will leave Dordrecht and he will spend about a year in Amsterdam. He'll be in Amsterdam from about May 1877 to mid-May 1878. So we're going to spend a year with Vincent van Gogh in Amsterdam, and then he's going to go to Belgium, the Borinage, the mines of the Borinage, for 3 years. It sounds like a long time, but there are not really very many letters dealing with that. He will then come back from that and spend about half a year in Etten, and then another, someone has just messaged me to say they're watching me. Good to see you. And then also The Hague for 2 years. So he'd spend another about 2 years. Then he would go to Drenthe and Newnan, and then Antwerp, and then Paris. A lot of those last four places in time and times deal with Van Gogh trying to become an artist. So a lot of those last four entries are him becoming an artist, and when he goes to Paris, he sort of feels like he's an artist. So but we're not really in that phase yet. He's becoming an artist in terms of his spirit and his thoughts, but he's not really doing any painting at this point. A couple of sketches in his diary. I think the fact that he keeps I think the fact that he writes these letters shows that he's becoming someone who has attention to detail and who notices color and is descriptive and expressive and alert to what's going on in his environment. And anytime you're doing that, I can tell you as someone who's written quite a few books that when you are describing scenes, so I've got one of my books here, right? Ouch. This book's about 500 pages. A lot of it is description, and a lot of it I do go and research things, clothing, terrain. You have to pay attention to the environment, and when you're in a different environment, you've got to pay even more attention to that. So does that make sense? So he's, in all these letters he's writing, he's also learning how to convey to a third person the things that he's seeing, and he's now going to have to translate that from words into colors and technique. And he's quite aware of a lot of different artist techniques, and he's now going to find his own. And in a way, the process he's going through now is Vincent van Gogh trying to find himself, not as an artist, but as a person. He's trying to find out who am I and what should a person be in this world. And of course, he's getting to know himself, he's getting to know the world as well. And he's also trying to go into the world, which will be why he goes to Belgium. Okay, so let's get going. Just look at some of your comments before I do. Nisi says, so many places in a short time, gone through so much already. Karina says, a pilgrim. I kind of did the same thing. I lived all over the country in South Africa. I lived overseas. Also felt like I was in many places in a short time. Okay, so Dordrecht, 22nd March 1877. Dear Theo, I want you to have a letter from me on your journey. What a pleasant day we had together in Amsterdam. Remember, him and his brother, I think they visited their uncle but they sort of spent time together in Amsterdam. He says, I stayed and watched your train until it was out of sight. We are such old friends already. How often haven't we walked the black fields with the young green corn together at Zundert, where at this time of the year we could hear the lark with father. This morning I went to Uncle Stricker's with Uncle Cor and had a long talk there on you-know-what subject, quite cryptic there. In the evening at 6:30, Uncle Cor took me to the station. It was a beautiful evening and everything seemed so full of expression. It was still and the streets were a little foggy, as they often are in London. Uncle had a toothache in the morning, but luckily it didn't last. We passed the flower market on the way. How right it is to love flowers and the greenery of pines and ivy and hawthorn hedges. They have been with us from the very beginning. He goes on to say, I've written home to tell them what we did in Amsterdam and what we talked about. On arrival here, I found a letter from home at the Reikens. Father was unable to preach last Sunday and the Reverend Mr. Cum stood in for him. I know that his heart burns for something to happen that will allow me to follow in his footsteps, not just some of the way, but all the way. Father has always, I think I could have put on my, sorry about that. So I just needed to take it off, put it onto Wi-Fi. We've just had a power failure. That was why it was on Wi-Fi. Anyway, he goes on to say, Father was unable to preach last Sunday and the Reverend Mr. Cum stood in for him. I know his heart burns for something to happen that will allow me to follow in his footsteps, not just some of the way, but all the way. Father has always expected it of me. Oh, may it come about and blessings be upon it. So there's already this talk about following in his father's footsteps. Of course, his father's a pastor and he preaches, and Vincent's already given his first sermon. I can also tell you, when I was in my 20s, I thought I might be following in my father's footsteps. I don't mean that I was like, I really want to. It was almost like, well, it looks like this is just kind of like, I don't really have any other choice. And then there was this period where I was studying what he studied and I was working for him. And long story short, it didn't work out. And in a way, it feels like a bit of wasted time and kind of disappointment. So I think I sort of can identify with that. I think it's a little bit different because I think he really wanted to, whereas I felt like it was sort of necessary, if I can put it that way. It seemed like the practical thing to do. Anyway, he says, the print you gave me, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. And the portrait of the Reverend Mr. Heldering are already up in my little room. Oh, how glad I am to have them. They fill me with hope. Now, it's actually quite ironic, the words that he says here, where he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. If you think about that in terms of Van Gogh, his words haven't passed away. His paintings haven't passed away. So quite ironic. Here we are more than 130 years later going through his letters word for word. They haven't passed away. He's passed away, but his letters live on. Writing to you about my plans helps me to clarify and settle my thoughts. To begin with, I think of the text, it is my portion to keep thy word. I have such a craving to make the treasures of the Bible's word my own, to become thoroughly and lovingly familiar with all those old stories, and above all, with everything we know about Christ. Then he says, in our family, which is a Christian family, in the full sense of the term, there's always been, as far as one can tell, someone from generation to generation who was a preacher of the gospel. Why should there not be a member of our family, even now, who feels called to that ministry and who has some reason to suppose that he may and must declare himself and look for means of attaining that end? Now, we're only kind of halfway through this letter, but let me just bring up that question again. What mental disorder or mental illness do you think Van Gogh has? Think about that question as we go through his writing, him expressing himself. So he goes on to say, "It is my prayer and fervent desire that the spirit of my father and grandfather may rest upon me, that it may be granted me to become a Christian and a Christian laborer, that my life may come to resemble, the more the better, those are the people I have mentioned above. For behold, the old wine is good, and I do not desire new." Now, it's quite interesting how his writing style is kind of changing here. He's writing in quite a biblical, he's got kind of quite a biblical turn of phrase. And does he say behold somewhere here? For behold, the old wine is good. He also says, let their God be my God and their people my people. Let it be my, saying things like, let it be my lot to come to know Christ, is also kind of a different way of talking. He goes on to say, okay, I'm not going to read that paragraph. He just talks about sorrowful yet always rejoicing. That comes up a lot. I think you can almost anticipate that spirit, talking about sorrowful yet always rejoicing. That comes up in the Borinage. It comes up where he goes to these coal mines and he encounters these sorrowful folk who are working in these pathetic conditions in coal mines. It's hard to think of a bleaker scene. And yet there's some, I wouldn't say there's a lot of joyfulness, but there's certainly some humor, there's some brightness, there's some twinkling going on in that sort of dark and gloomy environment. He says, my heart is full today with a text about those on the way to Emmaus, when it was toward evening and the sun was going down, but they constrained him, saying, abide with us. So his letters are still very chock full of religious feeling, if I can put it that way. Not there yet. Sorry, Nisi says, how depressing to see, yet there was still hope. Karina says he always kept the simple people, the simple working people in his heart. He goes on to say, it is dear to you too, that sorrowful yet always rejoicing, keep it in mind, for it is a good text and a good cloak to wear in the storm of life. Keep it in mind at this time, now that you have been going through so much. So obviously his brother's also going through some things. But what I want you to think about is, at this very young age, and at this point I think he's 23 years old, and he has already adopted this psychology of it's okay to be kind of unhappy, it's okay to struggle, it's okay to suffer, and you can find something to rejoice about within that. And think about that psychology and the way that people think of Van Gogh as this troubled guy who ... fill in the blank. You kind of get the idea that he's someone who's already transcended his suffering. He is someone who embraces his suffering and kind of sees the bright side to it anyway, right? Do you see what I'm saying? It's not quite the way that we see it, which is, wow, what a tragic, hard, difficult life he had, and it's also sad. People think that because they think it ended with his suicide. But if you take the suicide away, you get a totally different feeling about Van Gogh, that he kind of led exactly the life that he wanted to live, maybe minus the fact that he couldn't sell his art. Anyway, he goes on to say, it's a good cloak to wear in the storm of life. Keep it in mind at this time, now that you've been going through so much, and be careful, for though what you have been through is no small thing, yet as far as I can see, there's something still greater ahead, and you too will be put in mind of the Lord's word. I have loved you with an everlasting love, as one whom his mother's comforteth, so I will comfort you. I shall comfort you as one comforteth his mother. I shall comfort you another. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of that. It goes on for a while. Then he says in the next paragraph, hold on to what you have, Theo, my boy, brother whom I love. I long so fervently for the goal you know of, but how can I attain it? If only everything were already behind me as it is behind Father. But it takes so much hard work to become a Christian laborer and a preacher of the gospel and a sower of the word. And that's true. This, you might say that he was just in a funny mood and he'd eaten too much pizza, and he was having a Jerry Maguire moment, and it wasn't really a big deal. But the fact is, to become a pastor, he was going to need to study for something like 7 years or something like that. I'm not sure if it's still like that, but as far as I know, it takes quite a long time to be ordained. And, there's certain jobs that require a lot of study, being a doctor, being a veterinarian, being an architect. My sister studied architecture, and that's one of the hardest and most intensive courses that you can do. And then, of course, being a pastor also requires, I think you've got to study Greek and all sorts of things. Anyway, so he goes on to say, you see, Father can count his religious services and Bible readings and visits to the sick and the poor, and his written sermons by the 1,000, and yet he does not look back but carries on doing good. So he really admires his father. And the weird thing is, this admiration will sort of turn. This admiration that Van Gogh has for his father will kind of become something else. And I think to some extent it changes because of his parents' contempt for him. His parents are going to have some contempt for their son who just can't seem to get it together. I did say that when he left his job at Goupil, that was the beginning of a long downward spiral, because he never really had a proper job again after that. And so all of this, although it feels like he's heading in the right direction, in terms of if you're stuck in the psychology of Vincent van Gogh needs to get a proper job, well, that's never going to happen. That's already happened, and it's the past. He's never going to kind of go that way again. It sort of looks like that is happening, because he's got a job now in a bookshop. I'm not sure if the one job was that he was an accountant in the bookshop, and the other one was that he was just sort of a bookseller, but I guess we'll get to that. Then he says, best wishes on your journey, write soon, and accept a handshake in my thoughts. Your loving brother, Vincent. He says, I hope Father will soon be better. Try to be in Eton at Easter. It'll be so good to be together again. So now we go into the next letter. This is quite a long one. The next letter is dated late March, and not such a long one. Dear Theo, thanks for the letter which I received yesterday, having some spare time. I answer it today. I remember that when we were at the Van der Hoop Museum, we spoke about the book by Berger, so I'm sending it to you by post. You will find in it another wood engraving after Doré, Judith, and Holofernes. I don't know how to say that. It seems like maybe a Greek name or something. And one after Brian for your collection. Keep up your collection and you will have a fine one in time. He's talking about books, right? Please accept my small contribution to it. I'm so anxious to keep in touch with you through these little things. Whenever I enter my little room, the prints on the walls remind me of you. It is an old truth that the love between brothers is a strong support through life. Let us seek that support. May experience strengthen the bond between us. Let us be true and outspoken toward each other, and let us not have any secrets. So even in this letter to his brother, it sounds a little bit like a sermon to his brother. Let us do this. Let us be true. Let us not have any secrets. He also says, thanks for your last letter. And then he writes in quotes, it's not over yet, you say. No, it could not be over yet. Your heart will feel the need for confidence in itself and for unburdening itself. And you will be hesitating between two roads, she or my father. So I'm not sure whether he's met someone, not sure who the she refers to. He says, as far as I'm concerned, I believe that Father loves you more than she does, that his love is more valuable. It is pure gold. Who do you think the she is in this? He goes on to write, the child puts his faith in his father. The father is worthy of faith. For who is nearer than the Father in the kingdom of God or on earth? And this is apparently a Dutch hymn. Do go there whenever it becomes too much for you. Then he says, this week I received a letter from Uncle Vincent, who wrote that he did not think that carrying on the correspondence served any purpose, because in this case he could not be of any assistance to me at all. There was also a letter from Mr. Gladwell about Harry, who must have suffered agonies and had been sorely tried to have acted as if he did. Not quite sure if that's grammatically correct. Talks about enclosing a few poems, and let's go on to the next letter. This is from Etten, 8th of April, 1877. I wonder if I can find Etten in this map that I've got with me. Amsterdam, I think it's too small to find on this little map at the back here. But I think maybe, I don't want to sort of waste too much time looking for it. It is like a map that really unfolds quite a lot. Anyway, this is written from Etten. Let's just do a quick Google search, Etten to Amsterdam. It is an hour and 20 minutes. It's about 130 kilometers, which is a little bit less than 100 miles. So not that far away. Etten is sort of on the German side, which is to say east and kind of southeast of Amsterdam. The Hague is sort of south and slightly west. So it's kind of some distance. I never went to Etten when I was in the Netherlands. Dear Theo, I must send you another letter. As you see, I'm writing from Etten. Yesterday morning, I received a letter from home in which Father wrote that Erson was dying and that he had been to see him, as Erson had expressed a wish that Father should visit him. At this news, my heart was drawn so strongly towards Zundert that I longed to go there also. But more about this later. I've just read your last letter, from which I see that your trip is over and you are back in The Hague. Please write again soon and let us stay close together. Today I received that postcard from Anna saying she arrived safely. May she do well. I'm not sure what that means. Did she arrive safely in London or did she arrive in the Netherlands? Not quite sure. Has it struck you too that something has come over her that makes you think of the woman who loved Jesus, of whom the Bible speaks? And then he goes to a poem, and then he talks about, and how sweet she was with that family at Welwyn, that's in England, sharing their happiness and misfortune, and never withholding any help or comfort that was within her. Also in the days that child fell ill and died. So she was obviously, almost like an au pair in England, and she was helping a family, and then a child was born into that family that, I'm not sure if a child was born, but it fell ill and died. And so I think then they released her. He goes on to say, I've seen clearly how they all loved her. From the very beginning, she exerted herself to the utmost, rising early in winter to light the fire with her own hands, even though the first days were not easy for her. And she wrote, she often thought Without thou, O eternal being, what would man be on this earth? And goes on a little bit about that, and then says, and how she looked forward to communion and went to it and was fortified by it. And you really get the sense that he's really caught up in this fervor of certain books that he's reading, also the Bible. He's really caught up in it. He's trying to sound that way as well. In a way, it's kind of like borrowing strength. He's sort of nowhere in his life, but he's sort of trying to speak the part or write the part. Anyway, then he says, Saturday night I took the last train from Dordrecht to Oudenbosch and walked from there to Zundert. It was so beautiful on the heath. Though it was dark, one could distinguish the heath and the pine woods and moors extending far and wide. It reminded me of the Bodmer print hanging in Father's study. The sky was overcast, but the evening star was shining through the clouds, and now and then more stars appeared. It was very early when I arrived at the churchyard in Zundert. Everything was so quiet. I went over all the dear old spots and the little paths and waited for the sunrise there. You know the story of the resurrection. Everything reminded me of it that morning in the quiet graveyard. Having arrived at Urson's house, I heard from young Urson and Minky as soon as they got up that their father had died that night. Oh, they were so grieved and their hearts were so full. Hein also came very early in the morning. I was glad to be with them, and I shared their feelings, for I too had loved the man. The aunts send you their love, as well as Jan Doom, whom I also visited. From there I walked with Hein to Reisbergen and spent about an hour in the house. We read the Bible together. Voucher Prince had also sat up with the Urson 3 nights and had been with him to the last. That is apparently an old nurse, a nurse that had attended to them when they lived in Zundert. His passing was peaceful. I shall never forget that noble head lying on the pillow. It's kind of a weird allegory to his own head that Dr. Gachet would sketch, right? He says, the face showed signs of suffering, but wore an expression of peace and a certain holiness. Oh, it was so beautiful to me. It was characteristic of all the peculiar charm of the country and the life of the Brabant people. And they were all talking about father and how good he had always been and how much these two had loved each other. So you can see there's this almost admiration of being a pastor-like figure in the context of a beloved family member dying. You know, someone who's there to soothe, someone who's there to impart words and the grace of God to, you know, people who in times of grief, of desperation, of kind of trauma, you know, that when that feeling of raw vulnerability, you know, you can then step in and help them. He then says, then I walked with Hein Urson to Etten, and I'm home now, ready to start for Dordrecht early tomorrow morning. Goodbye, brother. It is mail time. A firm handshake and kind regards to all. From your loving brother, Vincent. Okay, so next letter. I think the next letter is either Amsterdam or just before. Okay, also Dordrecht, 8 April 1877, short letter. And this is a letter from Vincent's parents, Vincent's parents to Theo. Dear Theo, you did well to write to us. Bear up, my dear fellow, and always take an interest in life, also for our sake. So obviously Theo is going through a bit of a tough time. Oh, we can make things so pleasant for each other. Isn't this a great aim in life? Theo, what do you say about Vincent surprising us again? He ought to be careful. The key was to the churchyard. Thanks. Kindest regards from mother and everybody. Tomorrow, List will have to leave. Ever your loving father, TVG. I can't wait to get out of Dordrecht. I want to get to Amsterdam. Okay, so letter from Vincent to Theo, Dordrecht, 22nd April 1877. Quite a long letter. I'm just gonna no, not I can't I don't know if I can share this image, or maybe I can. So here is a sample of a sketch that Vincent does of windmills. So you can see that he is sort of doing a little bit of sketching at this point. Timmy, can you calm down, Timmy? Let me pick you up. Sorry about this. Sorry about that. Okay, dear Theo, I received your letter of April 21st, and he's writing the very next day, April 22nd. Thanks for writing so soon. The letter gave me a feeling of joy, like the woman who found her mite again must have felt. Not sure what that means. Does he mean the woman who found her itch? Not maybe mite means child. Just look that up quickly. What does mite mean? M-I-T-E. A small arachnid? No, I don't think it's that. Could it be something else? Just curious. Let's just see what comes up. A mite is also known as a Jewish coin. Mite can also mean a small amount of something. So yeah, a little bit confused by that. No, it's M-I-T-E. I don't think it means M-I-G-H-T. Okay, so anyway, let's just move on. It talks about, for you tell me that Aunt Quist's little writing desk with the letters from father and mother has been found by Mrs. Ruiz during the spring cleaning. How carefully and anxiously I looked for it last year, fancying I had taken it with me to England and had left it in one of the houses where I lived in London. I'm so glad it has been found. I'm so thankful for it. Keep it for me for the present. When I have started in Amsterdam, I shall want it. So he already knows he's going to Amsterdam at this point. It's only like about a week away. He says, now I remember quite well that I left it with Ruiz when I went to England because there was not much room in my trunk, and also because I thought it would be safer than taking it with me abroad. It seems to me a new proof and a hint. I've already observed more of them lately, that everything will be all right with me, that I shall succeed in the thing I so earnestly desire. Something of the old faith grows in me, that my thoughts will be confirmed, my spirit renewed, and my soul restored to the old faith. It will be a choice for my whole life! ! Fix your heart and mind upon a good thing and a good work also, and pray for it to the Lord. Uncle Jan has been to Etten and says that my little room is already waiting for me. Mr. Braat has somebody in mind for my place, so in May I shall probably be able to put my hand to the plow. He doesn't mean that literally, it's just a saying that means I'm going to, it's kind of like take the bull by the horns. He says, I will hang the prints you gave me in that little room, and so they will remind me of you daily. Underneath a print after Rosenthal, that monk, I've written, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up my cross and follow me. In the kingdom of heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage. Now one's also got to wonder, did Van Gogh not get married because he was a jerk, or Did he not get married because he was so ardent in his faith, or both? Then just jumping down a little bit, he talks about last week I had a letter from Harry Gladwell. He's in dangerous surroundings. The bird catchers there are numerous and cunning. I hope to hear more soon, and we will talk it over sometime. Then he talks about Taine's life. He says, I suppose he has traveled much in France, Italy, England, and also in Holland. So one would gather from his writings. He's surely an artist. I still have the first volume by Berger. Well, Theo, I hope you have a good Sunday today. If I go to Amsterdam, I hope to see you beforehand. And then he writes a postscript. It is raining here today, and one could almost fancy oneself in London. When I go to post this letter, I hope to walk down the little path behind the station where we walk together. And so at this point, Vincent is 24 years old. Okay. I think this is the last letter from Dordrecht, thank goodness. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Dordrecht, 30th April, 1877. Dear Theo, many happy returns of the day. I hope you will have a good time and great prosperity in the year that is to come. Time passes so quickly, the days fly by. Still, something must remain, and the past is not totally lost. We become richer and firmer of mind, of character, of heart. We may become richer in God. We may become richer in the pure gold of life, the love for each other and the feeling I'm not alone, for the Father is with me. He goes on to say, I hope to see you soon, for I intend to stop off at The Hague before going on to Amsterdam. Don't breathe a word to anyone, for my only wish is to be close to you. So he doesn't want to visit other friends. He only wants to see his brother. Then he says, next Wednesday morning, I'm leaving for Etten, where I intend to spend several days. Then I put my hand to the plow. So he's sort of anticipating this next job that he's doing, but it's sort of a means to an end to get to study what he wants to study. He says, I wish you had been here yesterday. In the morning, I heard the farewell sermon of the Reverend Mr. Huyer in the French church. The church was crowded, and he spoke with fire and enthusiasm. The sight of that grave, distinguished congregation struck me. The whole had an extremely serious atmosphere. He expressed his thanks for the love he had been shown by many, particularly during the trying times in the beginning, 4 years ago, when he had to wrestle with the difficulties of preaching in the French language, for he's a Dutchman. And so, of course, so is Vincent van Gogh. Several of the other preachers were here in the church. Yesterday's sermon happened to be on the same words he had preached about that first time. Now we look through a mirror into a dark reason. Now I only know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known myself. Jumping to the next paragraph. After church, I walked along the path behind the station where we walked together. My thoughts were full of you, and I wished we might be together. I walked onto the churchyard at the end of a black cinder track through the meadows. They looked so beautiful in the twilight. The churchyard reminds me of that drawing by Apel in Eigen Hart. A moat surrounds it, and there's a house circled by pine trees. Last night, a light was shining kindly through the windows. It is an old house and looks like a parsonage. So you can imagine that Vincent has, as a result of working for 6 years as an art dealer, a lot of the scenes he encounters wherever he is reminds him in a weird way of artworks that he's seen, which is quite incredible. And so he kind of has that as a sort of a reference, if that makes sense. I was just trying to see if I could find that particular artwork, but I can't. Anyway, so he goes on to say, right again soon, next Wednesday I shall be in Etten. Do you have, and he talks about certain books. He says, they reminded me of so many pictures by Rembrandt and others. I hope and believe I will not repent my choosing to try to become a real Christian and a Christian worker. Quite an interesting thing he's saying there, because I think he does later, I don't know if the word is regret that, but he certainly has mixed feelings about it later on. Certainly so do his parents. Because ultimately he doesn't make a success out of that. It's almost like he's too ardent. He's too intense, even for the church. In a way, it's quite difficult to imagine that you can be too intense for the church in terms of your faith. He says, yes, everything in my past experience may contribute to it through the acquaintances of cities like London and Paris and life in schools like those at Ramsgate and Alworth. One is strongly drawn and attached to many things and books from the Bible. He says, knowledge of and love for the work and the life of such men as now, these are obviously people that are influences in his life. Today influencers are people on Instagram. Then it was Millet, Rembrandt, Bosboom, Jules Breton, and so on. He says, what a resemblance there is between the work and life of Father and that of these men. I value Father's higher still. So he's really caught up in fervor and is inspired by kind of great men and great art, I guess. Woohoo! So this letter is from Amsterdam from the 19th of May, 1877. Today is the 21st of May, 2022. So what's that? Is it 100 and how many years is that? 155. I'm just trying to think. 77. I think it's 155 years ago, almost. So if you guys want to follow, I'm just putting a link to that letter. Donna says, by the way, he discouraged his brother, not wanting him to choose the woman's love over their father's love. It seems like total abstinence was the family way of thinking. So no wife for Vincent either. That's very interesting, Donna. Great to see that you know your stuff. It does seem like at this point, abstinence is the idea, but I think at some point that changes, and then they're not terribly happy about that. Okay, so let's go on to the next letter. Dear Theo, what a fine day we spent together, one we shall not easily forget. So this is obviously talking about them being together in The Hague before he went to Amsterdam. He says, I want to make sure you find a letter on your return from Etten. Oh, so maybe they met in Etten. You no doubt had a good time at home, so write soon and tell me how you spent the day. I'm closing something for your portfolio, a lithograph after J. Maris, which might be called A Poor Man in the Kingdom of God. I'm going to jump down a little bit. He talks about a place where he buys Latin and Greek books from a Jewish bookseller. He says, I had the chance of picking prints cheaply from a large batch. 13 pictures for 70 cents. I thought I would take a few for my little room to give it some atmosphere. He says, I will tell you what they are so that you can have some idea of what it looks like now and what I have hanging up. Am I going to go through these? One of them is a funeral procession in the cornfields. Another one is a poor man on a snowy winter road. I think a little old woman on a winter morning fetching hot water and coal. So all grim scenes, actually. And to him, these are beautiful scenes of kind of self-sacrifice and dedication, and the spirit of a human being bent over to honor fellow human beings. Someone just said to me, sleep well, sleep well. he goes on to say, yesterday Uncle Cor sent me a batch of old paper like the sheet I'm using to write you. Won't it be wonderful for working on? There's a lot of work to do already, and isn't it easy? But with steadfastness, one should get used to it. I hope to keep in mind the ivy which stealeth on though he wears no wings, as the ivy creeps along the walls. As the ivy creeps along the walls, so the pen must crawl over the paper. Every day I do some walking. Recently I went through a very pleasant district. When I walked down the Buitenkant to the Dutch railway station, one could see men working there, and alongside the edge with sand carts, and went along all sorts of little narrow streets with gardens full of ivy. It had a feel of Ramsgate about it. At the station I turned left where most of the windmills are, on a road along a canal with elm trees. Everything there reminds me of Rembrandt's etching. So here he is walking through Amsterdam, and it's just like walking through paintings to him. I was in Amsterdam in May 2019, the beginning of May and the end of May, and it's hard not to feel like you're in a painting when you're even in the modern Amsterdam. It just feels like you are tripping back in time. Something else that's maybe of interest to you guys, he talks about, I walked down the Buitenkant, which means the outside, I guess. I guess it's a road or a canal called the Buitenkant. When I lived in Cape Town, I went to an advertising school that was in a road called Buitenkant. It was either Buitenkant or Buitengracht, but yeah, so it's quite weird, the similarity there. Cape Town in South Africa was obviously a Dutch colony once upon a time, also had a couple of canals. Then he goes on to say, one of these days I shall make art with Strekfuss's Algemene Geskiedenis, that's a history book, or rather I've started it already. Sorry, not make art, make a start. That's a bit of a difference. He says, it isn't easy, but I certainly hope that taking it one step at a time and doing the best one can will pay off, but it will take time. Many testify to that. I'm just jumping down a little bit. It says, the work of men such as Father, the Reverend Mr. Keller van Hoorn, Uncle Stricker, and so many others requires a great deal of study. And the same is true of painting. He emphasizes that. He's saying the work of men such as blah, 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 blah requires a lot of study. And the same is true of painting. And a man may well ask himself, how shall I ever manage that? It's almost like he's saying that you've got to study painting. For one's own work, thoughts and observation are not enough. We need the comfort and blessing and guidance of a higher power. And that is something anyone who is at all serious and who longs to lift up his soul to the light is sure to recognize and experience. Pining for God works like leaven on dough. May it also prove to be true in the story of both our lives. So kind of what he's talking about here is validation. He's saying, your own work, it's almost like that whole thing of we are not saved through our own work, but by God's grace. And it's almost like he's saying here that no matter what effort he puts in, no matter what his own thoughts are, no matter what his own observations or what his powers of observation or perception are, that's never going to be enough. What he needs is the blessing of a higher power. He kind of needs God to validate his efforts, God to validate his work. And I think the difference between 24-year-old Vincent van Gogh and perhaps 34-year-old Vincent van Gogh is that this hunger, this thirst for validation, for this sort of almost kind of divine blessing has to some extent dissipated. I'm not saying it's gone, just that it is transformed into something else, where he has now decided he wants to be an artist, and art is the way to address this complexity of and this intensity of feeling that he can't really give expression to, not sufficiently at least. Then he goes on with a hymn, and then I'll go to this paragraph a little bit further down. It says, will you ever be joining me in some little church or other? God grant that you may, and I believe that he will grant it. Meanwhile, let us be grateful for our ordinary lives. You see the way that he's talking to his own brother is almost like a sermon. Regards to everyone at your place, and accept a handshake in my thoughts. And then he adds the postscript, I'm so tired at night that I no longer get up as early as I would want, but that I will pass, and I trust I shall be able to force myself to do it. So he's actually kind of quite exhausted by being caught up in whatever he's caught up with, and also working and, trying to combine those two. Now there's another letter, 22nd May, 1877. Timmy, I'm going to put you down. Amsterdam, 21st of May. Dear Theo, thanks for your letter and for the church certificate. It is a pity you were not in Eton at Whitsuntide. I certainly hope you will be able to go some other Sunday. He says, it is rainy today, and it was a long walk along the Buitenkant to the North Church. There are some beautiful churches here. This week I walked to the Zuiderzee, which means South Sea, along the dike to Seeburg. One passes the Jewish churchyard, and I visited it. It is very simple, full of elderberry trees and old headstones with Hebrew inscriptions. Occasionally the latter are covered with high dark green grass. Yesterday, Sunday afternoon, I went to Barn with Uncle Jan. How beautiful it is there. We walked through the avenues of pine trees and beeches in the wood and saw the sunset behind a coppice. I must say what comes across here, hey Stephanie, good to see you. What comes across here is, although Van Gogh has a fascination and an interest and a desire to know God, he also, right next to that, has a fascination and an interest and feels the resonance in nature. And you can already tell that he's very eloquent in describing the beauty and the sort of essence of nature, whereas he's kind of trying to do the same as a biblical chap, but he's sort of not quite there yet. He's not quite got that mantle of whatever it is yearning. Whereas when he's in nature, you get the feeling that he's able to see it for what it is and to represent it in a way that is not authentic, but in a way that is detailed and articulate, right? And that he carries with him for the rest of his life. He's definitely a man of, he's a sort of, what's that word? I wouldn't say an outdoorsman, but he's a outdoorsy person. He likes being in nature. He likes going for walks. He likes the trees, the lay of the land, the buildings in the sun. He likes to be outside of a building looking at it. He also says, this morning I glimpsed at church a little old woman, probably the chair renter, who made me think of the etching by Rembrandt where there's a sleeping woman, her head resting in her hand after a reading of the Bible. And then it's quite interesting, he writes here, Michelet, if my memory serves me correctly, wrote, there's no such thing as an old woman. And he would actually take that psychology to heart later on, where he would be with a old prostitute, I think, and obviously he is kind of taking this approach that a woman can be beautiful whether she's young or old or whatever, A woman is beautiful. That's kind of his attitude. Again, it's that very humble, simple approach, not only to fellow human beings, but also to the opposite sex, right? Nisi says a naturalist. He goes on to say, do you think we too shall be at the evening of our life before we know it, so to speak? If we feel the days are flying past us faster and faster, it sometimes does me good to believe so and to remember that man proposes and God disposes. Then we go to the 22nd of May. He says, last night I was at Uncle Stricker's where it was very pleasant. I came home after 11 and sat down to write until 12. And so this letter writing thing was something he was doing as a 24-year-old, and would be something he would be also doing as a 37-year-old in the last summer of his life, the last days and weeks of his life. It wasn't weird for him to be writing to his brother. It was just absolutely familiar. He says, I wish you had been with us last night. Write soon if you have a moment. He says, again, I have lots of work this morning. I tell you that it is not easy and that it will get more and more difficult. Nevertheless, I hope to succeed. And I'm also convinced that the habit of study will come to me through practice and that my work will improve and become more thorough. So he's working while he's studying the Bible, and he's also, I guess, going for walks, and he's also interested in, I guess, other things, books, literature, and art. And then he says here, I'm engrossed in the study of the Bible, but only in the evenings when my day's labors are done, or in the early morning. After all, it is the Bible that is essential, although it is my duty to devote myself to my other studies, which I do not neglect. Yesterday at Stricker's, they asked me to tell them about London and Paris. When I do, I see it all again before me. All that past time can be of help in my present work. I love so many things over there, and oh, it was so wherever I lived. How I feel it when I walk through the streets of The Hague or in Zundert, for instance. Do you notice that no matter where he is, it seems like he wishes he was somewhere else? When he's in Amsterdam, he misses The Hague or Zundert. Do you know what I mean? When he's in Amsterdam, he sort of talks about how the fogs were in London. He seems to sort of be pining for something else, no matter where he is. You kind of don't get you don't kind of get a sense of, I'm so happy to be here. Although I think to some extent you do have that when he's in Orvers, but it nevertheless becomes, it's so nice here, you need to come and visit. So there's still kind of a sense of, it's not enough, I need you to be here, kind of thing. A couple of you say he had a restless nature, a restless yearning spirit. And I do think, I say this with sympathy, it might seem a bit callous just to say this, but I do think that to be an artist, you've got to have a restless, unfulfilled spirit. You've got to have a sense of, put it this way, I don't think you can be completely happy and be a prolific artist or writer. There's got to be something eating at you, something that you're yearning about or yearning for. There's something that's incomplete, and you somehow can't find it in the real world. You can't find it in reality or in a person. And so you push that aside and you try and settle that score in writing, in art, kind of thing. Nisi says you can never stop, ever. So I think you need that sense of something that is incomplete, something that is unfulfilled, a yearning that is not satisfied, that the art then absorbs. It doesn't satisfy it, but it certainly is a place where it is addressed to some extent. And in a weird way, maybe it makes it worse, because the more time you spend away from reality, the less fulfilling reality becomes. Okay, so let's go on to the next letter. We've now 22nd May, we jump to 28th of May. Vincent to Theo from Amsterdam. Dear Theo, today was stormy. When I went this morning to my lesson, I stood on the bridge looking toward the Seder Seer. There was a white streak on the horizon. Now, is your imagination switch turned on? Imagine you're right there with him. You can feel the wind. You can see the sea, the little things, little details, little stone lying in the road, little bird flying by, and Vincent van Gogh is there, and he is, he's not this Vincent van Gogh. He's not this guy yet, but these eyes, this nose, this mouth is passing nevertheless through the landscape, and he's registering what he's seeing. And here it comes to us 155 years later. He says, there was a white streak on the horizon against which the long line of houses with the East Church stood out. Over it hung dark grey clouds from which in the distance the slanting rain came pouring down. Now you can either take those words and just turn on your imagination, turn on the afterburners and imagine it, or you could go there. You could go to where he stood on the bridge looking toward the Seder Seer and go, this is where he stood. And this is where he looked towards, and know that this was a moment in reality then that is brought forward to now, of just a man who had become this well-known artist, looking at something and feeling a certain way. Then he says, yesterday Uncle Jan went to Leiden, so I was alone for the day. In the morning, I went to the East Church. In the afternoon, I walked toward the seaside, and I've been working the rest of the day. The work does not come to me easily and quickly as I would wish, but practice makes perfect. I hope only if I could, I should like to skip a few years, my boy. That's quite a deep, not hope, but that's quite a deeply expressed, quite a deeply expressed sentiment that he's just wishing that he could skip a few years into the future, that he's obviously not enjoying this present struggle of his youth. He wishes he could, it's like, if this cup could pass me by, he wishes he could just skip to when things are, the momentum is moving a bit better. And it reminds me a bit of that movie Click, where the guy gets a remote control and he's able to skip a few years, and he ends up skipping almost like through his whole life. Anyway, he says, I think one only gets some peace after one has accomplished a few years of study and feels one is getting on. So here he is actually acknowledging that he's feeling small, insignificant, is feeling like a nobody, that is nowhere. And if you think about it, he's 24 years old and he is kind of starting again. I've also kind of been there in the sense that in my first year at varsity, I studied law. And then I, as I said, followed in my father's footsteps, and I studied quantity surveying to go into the building industry. And after 3 very long years, I realized I just couldn't continue with that. I couldn't continue on that path. And then I changed from quantity surveying to a degree in commerce, BCom. And of course, I was studying, one of the subjects that I had throughout was law. It was things like criminal law, commercial law, family law, private law. So although I studied all sorts of things, applied maths, Roman law, the history of architecture and all sorts of stuff, all these things that I studied, even studied Afrikaans and Dutch, the language. And anyway, despite all those other things, peripheral things I studied, I also studied law. And I always enjoyed law. Anyway, and so here I am. And so so when I changed from, the quantity surveying to the BCom, it also felt like, wow, I'm 23, 24 years old and I'm nowhere. And now starting from scratch again, and it's definitely frustrating feeling. And I think it's especially frustrating if you are quite an intense character and you want to get going, and meanwhile you are almost like behind everybody now, and you wanted to get ahead, I guess. Anyway, he goes on to say, this morning I was in Uncle Stricker's study. It is a beautiful room, and a portrait of Calvin by Ari Scheffer hangs there, yet I should like to see more prints on the wall. I do think you've got to acknowledge that this is not just nice that Vincent van Gogh wrote so many letters you could fill a book with them. I think he was so lonely, and the periods of struggle were so extended that he had a lot of time on his hands to write a crapload of letters. The letters aren't really a sign of a happy young man. It's a sign of frustration. It's a sign of a life that is being slowed down, that is kind of anchored in a way and not set free, right? Let's just read what Nisi said there. Nisi says his mind is starting to question his journey so far. He seems to have too much adrenaline, not there. It says if we were all the same, nothing. If we were all the same, nothing would be accomplished as a whole. Stephanie says, did Nick address the poll yet? I'll address it now. Robbie Robbins said, I had to study the history of architecture with my A-level art. I was not very good at the architecture part, but would be more interested now. Real Batman says, to create true lasting art, the opinions of others are useless. The art is at a much higher level. I do agree with that in the sense of truly good art and truly good anything tends to be that one thing that most people aren't capable of, which is an original thought. If you watch the movie A Beautiful Mind, what they talk about in that is John Nash, who eventually wins the Nobel Prize, was at university and he was just struggling. The thing he wanted to do was come up with an original idea within the field, within the theories and theorems of mathematics. And so while all his pals seemed to be achieving certain things, he was just sort of trying to come up with an original thought. And it seemed like he was the biggest flop and the biggest failure of all of his buddies. They were attending class and they were apparently successful, and he seemed to be this failure. And then he came up with an idea after a long, long time, and it was an incredible idea, but it was an original thought and it was applied in various ways. So on the one hand, I agree with you, Real Batman, about that it dismisses the opinions of others, but I do think there's a place for standing on the shoulders of giants and then reaching out from that point into the unknown. In other words, you are educated in the brilliance of other minds, but you then, from that position, step into the heavens and find a star. If that makes sense. That is why I sort of feel like what I've done in true crime is I've definitely stepped on the shoulders of people like Ernest Becker and to some extent Campbell, and people like that. And in other words, you educated in that, but then you take it further. You've got to take it further. You can't just sort of, in other words, you take that psychology into a different context. And obviously with Vincent van Gogh, he wasn't, he was very well educated in art and artists, but you also do need to take that point where you say, I'm so confident in this idea based on what I know that I don't need your approval. You know what I mean? That is important in order to have an original idea. I think one thing that I've carried with me my whole life was a sort of stubborn pursuit of what I regard as the truth. And it might not be the truth, but it's certainly this idea that the evidence and common sense and logic seems to support that this is realistic, at least, if not true, at least realistic, at least reasonable. And that is often what the law does as well. The law will say, based on the evidence, this appears to be true. And it may not be true, but it is reasonable. It may not be right, but it certainly is quite a good way of getting to that point. And if people disagreed with me, I was like, well, this trumps that. And that's also what John Nash did, and Van Gogh did as well. But it's not an easy way to live. It's not an easy way to sort of go, because you come across as arrogant and you come across in a way as stupid. Like if you take this whole depth versus herd thing, it's easy to go along with the crowd and to go along with the herd and then appear, I don't know if you appear clever, but to go against that just seems stupid. It's like everybody else sees this, why don't you? Real Batman says, I've read much Richard Feynman. I think they knew each other. Richard won a Nobel Prize in physics. Nisi says, you definitely are a realist. Okay, so let's keep going. Sorry, let's just look at that. Let's look at the poll. Which mental disorder did Vincent van Gogh have? Well, now it's almost an even race. Schizophrenia, about a third of you. Bipolar, about a third of you. None of the above, about a third of you as well. Borderline personality disorder, just 2%. So maybe just one of you voted for that. So quite a few of you, let's say 60% of you think that it could have been schizophrenia or bipolar. It's quite interesting. So basically 2/3 of you think that he did have some kind of mental disorder. But let me just repeat the question. Which mental disorder did Van Gogh have? And do you see evidence of it when we read these letters? Do you kind of get the feeling that he's cuckoo already? Does he already have a mental disorder in these letters? Do these letters show a mental disorder? Anyway, going back to his letter, he says, last week I got as far as Genesis 23, where Abraham buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, the plot he had bought, and without really thinking about it, I drew a little sketch of how I imagined the place. It is not worth much, but I enclose it herewith. Well, unfortunately, that sketch is not it's not here. Yesterday, I had a good letter from home and answered it today. I hope you will write soon. I'm looking forward to it. Just now, the men from the wharf are going home. Such an intriguing sight. I hear them already early in the morning. I think there are about 3,000 of them. And the sound of their footsteps is like the roaring of the sea. I think he's talking about the sort of the jetty harbor type areas in Amsterdam, where some of the boats are moored. And bear in mind that the Netherlands used to have the world's biggest naval fleet. It used to be a naval superpower. And it is a kind of a naval, there's a lot of, there are ships that move across the countryside. Have you ever seen those photos or video even, where you see like a field of flowers and maybe a windmill, and then this big ship passing right, seeming to cut right through the land, and it's kind of going on a canal. So very ship heavy country in a sense. I think Rotterdam, I'm not sure if Rotterdam is still the biggest port in the world, but if it's not, it's one of the biggest. Rotterdam, not Rotterdam. Rotterdam is the second largest city in the Netherlands. I just want to see if it's got the biggest. $2.7 million people. I'm just trying to see what it says about. Rotterdam is Europe's largest seaport. That's quite an achievement. So for such a small country, Rotterdam is still Europe's biggest harbor. It's quite amazing. Nisi says, I don't see much, if any, mental illness in these letters. That's interesting observation. Donna says, as a younger man, up as a clergyman, he must have gotten a ton of respect and attention, which he's not getting in his travels. It's like deflating a ball and then add mental illness on top of that. That's quite interesting. Nisi says, I see a brilliant young man making his way through the difficulties in his life, trying to find his way and tame his gifts, but no mental illness. Okay. So he talks about 3,000 men. The sound of their footsteps is like the roaring of the sea. And it's kind of like he's not one of them. He's not part of this march of whatever they are, sailors, fishermen. He is somehow apart from that. He's an observer. He talks about, this morning I bought a small engraving to Bias after Rembrandt from a Jew for 6 cents. Uncle Jan sends you his compliments. He says Aunt Minna is going to Etten in a few days, which will be nice for Mother. Father wrote me that the church has been whitewashed and the organ painted. Yesterday he baptized 3 children. Liz is not yet better, and Wilhelmine or W. van Eekland's wife is also very ill. Did you hear that Uncle Vincent has bronchitis again, and it seems to be very bad? It's lucky that he's not abroad, but in his own house, and that father and mother can visit him almost daily. Well, boy, be as happy as you can. My compliments to the Roos family. Write soon. With a firm handshake, your loving brother, Vincent. In case you guys are interested, I read an article saying that coronavirus, Omicron anyway, is likely not to, it's not going to just be gone. They said that you can get reinfected many times, and so this idea that it's done, it's gone, appears to be wishful thinking. Just saying that's something I read. Researchers are saying that whether you've been vaccinated or you've had it, you can get reinfected just a couple of months later, and these subvariants of Omicron are apparently very good at dodging immunity, which is definitely not good. Karina says, I'm with you, Nisi. Not there yet, says she doesn't think Van Gogh is there yet in terms of mental illness. Robbie Robbins says, I don't think he has mental illness, but possibly a developmental disorder which affects his mental health. Okay, I see we're at 1 hour 24. We'll probably go another 20 minutes. Okay, so this is 30th of May from Amsterdam. Dear Theo, thanks for your letter that arrived today. I'm very busy and write in a hurry. I gave your letter to Uncle Jan. He sends you his greetings and thanks for it. There was a sentence in your letter that struck me, and he quotes it. He says, I wish I were far away from everything. I am the cause of all and bring only sorrow to everybody. I alone have brought all this misery on myself and others. So can you believe it? These are Theo's words to Vincent. And so obviously Theo's not in a terribly good place himself. Let me read that again. He says, I wish I were far away from everything. I'm the cause of all and bring only sorrow to everybody. I alone have brought all this misery on myself and others. He says, these words struck me because that same feeling, just the same, not more or less, is also on my conscience. So that's quite profound. You know, he's 24 years old and he wishes he was far away from everything. He doesn't want to be in Amsterdam. He feels like he's a burden to others. And he's kind of admitting to not feeling terribly happy, despite all of this kind of highfalutin language. He's basically feeling pretty miserable. Then he says, when I think of the past, when I think of the future of almost invincible difficulties, of much and difficult work, which I do not like, which I, or rather my evil self, would like to shirk, when I think the eyes of so many are fixed on me, who will know where the fault is if I do not succeed? So you obviously have a situation here. You know, we are adults, I think many of us in this class, in a situation, and it's easy to forget that once upon a time we were 20-somethings and we felt like we were disappointments to ourselves and maybe to others. I know I did. In fact, I felt like a disappointment for a really, really long time. And that kind of weighs on you for a really long time. It's like only once you've got that job are you acceptable in the eyes of the public. Only once you've got this much money, especially as a man, are you acceptable. Only when you reach that point. Until then, you're invisible. You don't have any status. You are a nobody and a nothing. And I must say, I felt that very, very keenly when I went to England. And I like realized that the system in England is very much, there's a unstated but nevertheless very real sort of class system there. So if you have that job, then you are regarded as whatever. And if you from that neighborhood, and so, you know, I arrived there and I was just trying to survive and you know, have a good time with my girlfriend, and I was just trying to sort of make ends meet. So I worked as a kitchen porter, and I worked in a factory, and I packed tubes of Colgate toothpaste, and I packed boxes, and I didn't care. I was just sort of trying to make my way. But then after a year of doing that, I was like, wow, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. You know, I can type. I'm university educated. Maybe I should not work in industrial settings. And so then from then on, I worked like in call centers and in, investment banking companies and insurance companies and the corporate headquarters of X, Y, and Z. And that was, I guess, a higher position or whatever you want to call it. But it just came from the decision to go, okay, I think I'm going to not work in that setting anymore. And then I did. But I was also quite amazed at how people treated you. Like, it was literally, what's your job? How much money do you have? Okay, well, that's who you are. And maybe I was naive, but it was nevertheless, okay, I guess that's how the world works. And I never really paid much mind to it until my girlfriend at the time left me for a guy with much more money. And then I was suddenly like, wow, I guess it is an issue. I guess it is an issue I need to pay more attention to. So, but what I'm doing, I'm not trying to be self-indulgent here. I'm trying to just show you that when you're a young person, you can be quite naive about that it's not important, And on the other hand, you can also be quite naive. And then you wake up and you realize, wow, the society around me don't give me any credit. The society around me don't regard me, don't respect me, don't acknowledge me. I'm a nothing. And anybody wants to be seen as a human being, as a part of society. But society nevertheless has its own rules where they say, well, prove it. Talk is cheap, kind of thing. Although, funny enough, you can be a YouTuber and talk is very cheap, but you nevertheless can be very powerful in today's society. It's almost like things have changed from then, when now talk can be very expensive, even though talk is still cheap in a way. Let's just look at some of your comments. Karina says, we women also bear great pressures coming of age. I dare say those feelings of disappointing others are very familiar to me. Not there, it says, yes, I'm sure the pressure of groupthink can certainly create a sense of despair in some people if not handled well. So, some young people who are otherwise well adjusted may have this feeling of, I have to show I'm original, or I have to show I'm special. And then they do that by copying someone else or borrowing something from someone else in a way. In other words, they achieve that sense of feeling special by being part of a particular think tank or culture tank, whatever. Stephanie says, he says a child who is praised becomes praiseworthy. Okay, so he goes on to say, if I do not succeed, who will not make me trivial reproaches, but as they are well tried and trained in everything that is right and virtuous. He goes on to say, we have done for you what we could. Have you tried honestly? What is now our reward and the fruit of our labor? See, when I think of all this and of so many other things like it, too numerous to name them all the difficulties and cares that do not grow less when we advance in life, of sorrow, of disappointment, of the fear of failure, of disgrace, then I also have the longing. I wish I were far away from everything. So yeah, you really have two brothers acknowledging and sharing this sense of despair, the sense of not gaining traction in their lives respectively. And bear in mind, Theo's got quite a good job. He's working at Gogh, but they both feel like they are not well regarded, and that's bothering them. Vincent van Gogh goes on to say, and yet I go on, but prudently and hoping to have strength to resist those things, so that I shall know what to answer to those reproaches that threaten me, and believing that, again, this language is very much like a sermon. He says, and believing that notwithstanding everything that seems against me, I yet shall reach the aim I am striving for, and if God wills it, shall find favor in the eyes of some I love, and in the eyes of those that will come after me. You do kind of get the sense that almost one of the ways that he's trying to transcend and get away from everything is through just this language that he's using. It's like he can't bear to just say what is actually happening. He's got to adopt this highfalutin, powerful, biblical tone, right? Because real life is just too grim, right? He says, there it is written, lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. And when the disciples had worked all night and had not caught any fish, they were told, go out into the deep and cast your nets again into the sea. And then he writes, my head is sometimes heavy and often it burns and my thoughts are confused. I don't see how I shall ever get that difficult and extensive study into it, to get used to and persevere in simple, regular study after all those emotional years is not always easy. And yet I go on. So here he's kind of admitting that he's feeling quite hopeless, that he just, although he's trying very hard, he says his head burns and his thoughts are confused. He says, doesn't know how he's going to get all of this difficult and extensive study. He says, and yet I go on. If we are tired, isn't it then because we have already walked a long way? And if it is true that man has his battle to fight on earth, is it not then the feeling of weariness and the burning of the head a sign that we have been struggling? And it is really quite heartbreaking to read this, that he was 24 years old and he's talking about struggle and battling and so 13 years later he would be still locked into this almost existential struggle that he wouldn't win. He wouldn't win this struggle. And isn't it any wonder that he said on his deathbed at 37 years of age, at near the end of the summer of 1890, he said, the sadness will last forever, because he was trying to overcome his sadness. He was trying to find a way out of the struggle. He wasn't like, he wanted a better life and he just never got it. In the end, the sadness he drowned in it, I guess, in a way. He goes on to say, when we are working at a difficult task and strive after a good thing, we fight a righteous battle, the direct reward of which is that we are kept from much evil. I'm not going to read the next paragraph. Then he talks about, when I found myself in front of the corpse of Erson, the calmness and dignity and solemn silence of death contrasted with us who still live, to such an extent that we all felt the truth of what his daughter said with such simplicity. She said, quote, "He is freed from the burden of life, which we have to go on bearing," end quote. And yet we are so much attached to the old life because next to our despondent moods, we have our happy moments when our heart and soul rejoice, like the lark that cannot keep from singing. So can you see, once again, he takes this whole unvoicable, unquenchable, impossible burden, and he somehow translates it to a bird singing in the morning. And he says, even though the soul sometimes sinks within us and is fearful, he translates that whole deplorable misery into this image of a bird singing in the morning. And that's how he sees himself, as this bird that gets up and goes about its work, trying to sing a happy song, trying to beat back the darkness of the night and the harshness of the day with the energy that birds have early in the morning, the spirited singing that birds have early in the morning. He goes on to say, and the memories of all we have loved stay and come back to us in the evening of our life. They are not dead but sleep, and it is well to gather a treasure of them. A handshake and write soon, your loving brother Vincent. Quite a deep letter, isn't it? Quite a heartfelt letter. Again, ask yourself, does this sound like the words of someone who's mentally ill, or someone who's going to become mentally ill? Nisi says he can compare just about anything mechanical to nature. Donna says that helps explain why they are so close. Brothers are close, but they seem a little over with all the letter writing. 31st of May, 1877. Dear Theo, it is already late and everyone is asleep, but I feel that I must write to you once more. You tell me in your last letter that you dream of going to another city. If you get the chance, you mention London or Paris. That isn't bad, I think, old son. I love those towns with all my heart. I know that I like certain aspects and that I detest others, or better, that I do not like certain things about the hawthorn hedges, green grass, and the little grey churches. No, it is not a bad idea. Remember only that we both have to reach the cape of 30 to keep us from sin. Since the life that is given us, we have had to fight the good fight and to become men, but we are not them anymore, neither one or the other. My conscience tells me that there's a lot more to do to become perfect. We are far from the worth of others, but we have the ability to strive. You know, I have the ambition, for I one day have the joy to become a pastor and to acquit my task like our Father. I will thank God. He's saying, if I can, I will thank God. He says, I have strong hopes of success. Once somebody who was more advanced in life than I and who was no stranger to Jerusalem, meaning he had sought after it and found it, said to me, I believe you are a Christian. It did me so much good to hear this. Whatever you wish for yourself too, hold firm to the thought of Christ and treasure his word. Again, feels a lot like a sermon. I'm going to jump a bit forward. Wow, it's quite a long letter, this. On and on and on. I'm just going to jump to the end. He says, herewith something else by Isquiros. Be as happy as possible. Write soon again. Compliments to the Ruist family. Your loving brother, Vincent. Okay. Shall we go through another letter? And that takes us into June. This is a letter from Vincent's parents to Theo, to his brother. Zundert, 1877. Looks like Vincent didn't keep any of the letters his parents sent them, which I think is quite significant. Do you notice that? Nisi writes, in my opinion, Vincent van Gogh was so driven with a strong will to succeed, he may have been depressed at not reaching his goals. Something that I meant to say in the live with Stephanie was one of the ways that you may experience a nightmare in your life is the extent to which you feel like you enjoyed a fairy tale. So it might be that you were in love with someone and that chapter or that episode or that season felt like a fairy tale. Well, that only makes it so much worse when it's over, because if it was just this, I'm not really expressing it very well, but certain things, when they are kind of like a fairy tale, you get caught up in the magic of it, but that makes the nightmare on the other side of it so much worse, right? So sometimes I've compared it to one person's fairy tale is another person's nightmare, but you can also get caught up in something that is perhaps pleasant, that is perhaps good, and you start losing touch with the reality of your own life, and your own life starts to feel like a fairy tale. And maybe that happened with Johnny and Amber, where it felt like, and it may not have been for months on end, it may have felt like that for a few moments here and there or a few days here and there, but it feels like this incredible fairy tale. And you get so caught up in that the contrast is almost like a nightmare. And so in other words, I'll give you quite a good example that I think will make it explicit what I'm talking about. When I was in my 20s, I was in incredible shape physically. I had a body fat of 6-7%, which is like world class for a triathlete. In my very first national championships, so my very first race at South African Triathlon Championships, or my very first year, I came 6th in the country. And so that felt like this fairy tale. And so when I try to repeat the fairy tale, when I try to, kind of improve on it, I couldn't for various reasons. And then that was the beginning of my nightmare. And where I am right now, I'm obviously twice the age I was earlier on. I want to revisit that fairy tale, but in a realistic way. I obviously don't want to be 7% body fat, but I do want to be thinner and fitter and so on. But to do that, you've got to do it realistically. You've got to train realistically, not overtrain, not get injured, not break ribs, and so avoid the nightmare. So in other words, you want to have a better life, but don't pursue it like it's a fairy tale. You need to bring it down a notch. Otherwise, you're going to propel yourself into a nightmare, or you're going to have a fairy tale for a while, which is going to become a nightmare, if that makes sense. In other words, you've got to be realistic in your ambitions. Is the example that I gave you, does it make sense what I'm trying to express? Donna says, I stay away from my family. My family is a schizophrenic family unit, and I was their scapegoat. Well, that's sad to hear. I hope you're going to feel comfortable with this family here. Nisi says, in our 50s, we want the past, but must be careful and be absolutely realistic. You don't have to be absolutely realistic. You don't have to be grim and sober and somber, but you've got to be practical, I think is the best word. It's okay to be inspired. It's okay to, I don't really think I can say it better than that, to be inspired and then to apply it in a practical and realistic way. Stephanie says, my close friends and I used to write each other letters, and I lived in the same town and went to the same school. We just loved getting letters in the mail. I was like that as well. When I was, I think, in high school and early university, I wrote to people all around the world. I wrote to people in America, in the UK, in Australia, I think South America as well. Also some of these very obscure countries in Europe. I don't know if it was Croatia or one of those countries. And I also just loved going to the post box and getting like 6 or 8 letters from all over the world. I wrote to someone from Ireland for many years. And that went on for so long that even when I go to visit my father, I still can't resist going to the post box because it was something I did every single day, sometimes 2-3 times a day. And so I was also really caught up in the joy of writing letters and corresponding, and it really is a beautiful thing in a way. And I suppose not everyone's cut out to do that. But I'm just saying, even now as a 50-year-old, if I go and visit my dad and I see the post box, I sort of feel like I want to go and open it and see there's a letter for me, because that's how much I was writing and what I did every single day at a certain point. There was also someone who I was sort of her, not guardian angel, but it sort of felt like I was her, something like that, confidant. What do you call it? If somebody has someone that helps them, it's often mentioned in art, not a muse, but what's the word when someone provides almost like a guiding role to a younger person? What's that? What's the word for that? I just can't think of the word. Come on, guys, help me out. Yeah, kind of like a mentor. It's not quite the word, but it's something like that. Let's see if you can come up with a better one. no, it's not quite a mentor. It's like someone is your protege. It's a little bit like that. But anyway, so I kind of played that role. I was a little bit older than she was, and she said that I played a really big role in giving her guidance, and I think you had that a bit with Vincent and his brother. Yeah, a little bit like that. Not a guardian. I can't quite think of the word. Like you have a protege, and just can't quite think of it. I did say confidant. So see if it's not a disciple, it's not an apprentice. I think it's sort of a protege, but I'm not sure if you're the protege, what do you call the person that's guiding you? What do you call that? Does that make sense? Anyway, coach, not quite that. Okay. Yeah, I just can't think of the word. Okay, so let's go to letters from probably just like a kind of like a role model, but it's not quite that either. Okay, letters from his parents to Theo, Zundert, 1877, guidance counselor. Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 7 May 1877. We are having an agreeable time with Vincent. It is very cozy. On Monday morning, that's 14th of May, he will leave us. This morning, again, a nice letter from Uncle Jan, very kind and friendly. Also from Uncle Stricker. He has found a capable teacher. So that now we start the undertaking with courage, hoping for God's blessing. We have improved his appearance a little bit with the help of the best tailor from Breda. Not sure if that's a reference to Uncle Stricker or Vincent, probably Uncle Stricker. Would you be so kind as to do another work of mercy and have his chevalier metamorphosed by a clever hairdresser? Yeah, in Eton we don't have such people. I suppose a barber of the Hague might be able to do something about it. Therefore, try to coax him into coming with you to one. I'm not sure who he's talking about, and if they're trying to improve Vincent's appearance. He says, it is not clear how we will manage. The teacher costs 1.50 guilders per lesson, and every day a lesson makes 9 guilders per week, and lessons in other subjects will probably also be necessary. We insist that Vincent pays visits to Tierstig, Hanebeek, and Mauve. Please collaborate! ! We hope Mrs. Tierstig will be all right. Vincent hopes to arrive in The Hague on Monday afternoon around 6 o'clock. We wish him all the best. So there's a little bit of griping here about the cost of Vincent's lessons. And yeah. 7th June 1877. Theo, Uncle Vincent loves you so much. I believe that after the disappointment with Vincent, the thought that you may succeed in his old favorite trade gives him a hope in life. So it's quite common. It's kind of expressed quite openly that Vincent is a disappointment to the whole family, right? And so he says, write him from time to time, that'll give him pleasure, and tell him about everything. He is so nice to us that we should cooperate as far as we can to give him some joy in life. So they obviously feel that Theo is like their last hope. No, not a paragon. No. Letter from Vincent to Theo, 4 to 5th of June, 1877. Dear Theo, how long is this letter? Okay, this is going to be the last letter. It's from Donna says, Social media can alter a person's reality. You have hundreds of friends online, but who will show up on the dirt road to fix your tire? True. Nisi says the tides seem to be turning with how they feel towards Vincent. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a patron. Stephanie says, no wonder he's depressed. He's not mentally ill. He has reason to be sad. Yeah. Okay, so this is the last letter. So he writes, Dear Theo, you remember that night at Dordrecht when we walked together through the town, around the great church and through so many streets and along the canals in which the old houses and the lights from the windows were reflected. You spoke then about the description of a day in London by Théophile Gautier, the coachman for a wedding party in front of the door of a church on a stormy, foggy day. I saw it all before me. If that struck you, you will also appreciate the pages I enclose. Lamartine's Cromwell. Apparently, Vincent copied 3 full pages, part of which is added to this letter. He goes on to say, I read them on a very stormy day last week. It was in the evening, and the sun set through a ruddy glow on the grey evening clouds, against which the masts of the ships and the row of old houses and trees stood out. And everything was reflected in the water, and the sky threw a strange light on the black earth, on the green grass with daisies and buttercups, and on the hushes of white and purple lilacs, and on the elderberry bushes of the garden in the yard. In London, I had read that book of Lamartine's, and I was very much struck by it. The last pages especially made a deep impression on me. Tell me what you think of it. These places mentioned in it, Hampton Court with its avenues of linden trees full of rookeries, Whitehall overgrown with ivy at the back, and the square bordering St. James's Park, where one can see Westminster Abbey. They are all before me, and the weather and the gloomy atmosphere. It keeps me from sleeping. Were you in Eton Sunday? I certainly hope so, and that you had a pleasant day. I gathered this from a sentence in the last letter from Eton. We expect Theo probably next Sunday. This evening I have to go to Uncle Stricker's. Went to early service yesterday morning. Heard a sermon on the text, Do you want to be healthy? How they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. After that I heard Uncle Stricker in the well-known Amstel Church on blah, 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 blah. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. He says, I'm very busy, so adieu. Perhaps I will continue this letter tonight. A handshake from your loving brother, Vincent. He goes on to say, today when I passed the flower market on the Single, which is a street, I saw something very pretty. A peasant was standing selling a whole bunch of pots with all kinds of flowers and plants. Ivy was behind it, and his little girl was sitting behind it all. Such a child as Maris would have painted. So again, he sees scenes around him and he sees them as art. And I've got to tell you, I have a little bit of that. If I'm in my garden and I see flowers in a certain formation, also if I'm driving or I'm in a particular outdoor setting or landscape or the sun setting, I sometimes also see it as a painting. And I actually have a hashtag. I don't know if it's, as far as I know, I created it. I certainly didn't see it somewhere. But I sometimes will take a picture and then I'll hashtag it flowers as art, because it looks like it's not real. It actually looks like a painting. Yeah, that's it. And it's that same sense of seeing in the everyday something that is more than what it is. It is something that is so beautifully put together, but obviously by by happenstance that it looks like art. And I often do that when I'm driving. If I'm driving and the way the road curls into the distance, or, I often see that as not just a road, but something that's symbolic, something that belongs in a magazine, or something that just has an epic quality to it. And I think that's quite nice to do that, is to look at certain things not just for what it is, but that thing that you're looking at is almost symbolic of something that is greater than itself. And isn't that what art is? But reality can be that as well. Reality can be symbolic of itself in a sense, it sounds a bit silly, but it can achieve a resonance that is quite interesting and compelling, I guess is the word. So he talks about seeing this little girl sitting there, and he sees it as a painting by Maris, and he says, so simple in a little black bonnet and with a pair of bright smiling eyes. He says she was knitting. The man praised his wear, and if I could have spared the money, I should have liked only too well to buy some. And he said, pointing unintentionally at his little daughter also, doesn't it look pretty? So just a moment that he captures. Am I going to go through this as well? 5th of June, not going to go too much through that, but he talks about the ground dark, the sky still lit by the glow of the setting sun, the row of houses and steeples against it. We were so struck by the beauty of it that we began to talk about many things. I sat up writing late last night and was up again early this morning. It was such beautiful weather. At night, there's also a beautiful view of the yard. Everything is dead quiet then. Write me soon. Tell me if that part about Cromwell isn't taken from the very heart of London. Anyway, so I see we just passed the 2-hour mark. I'm going to sign off here, but I want to give you guys a mission. You can choose to accept it or not. But I see some of you are letter writers. Are there not any of you want to write to one another? In other words, get one another's addresses and write. Let's maybe start with a postcard. And, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of you, because you guys live all over the world. There's someone from Austria. There's someone, I think, from Australia. There are those of you in America. So when you want to just try that, send one another postcards. And the point that I want you to consider in these postcards is describe something around you so don't just pick anything, don't go, okay, well, here's a pink magic marker. It reminds me of cigars when you've been smoking magic mushrooms. You know what I mean? Think about or be open to the moment where something that is both exceptional and commonplace catches your attention, and then stop and slow down and describe it. You don't have to have the postcard with you. Maybe you can have a notebook with you. And all I'm doing is stop your day, stop whatever you're doing, and then just record that. I'm glad that made you laugh. Record that particular moment, but in terms of description, and try and do it in the same style that it's not overly descriptive and over flowery, the same kind of style that Van Gogh has, where you are describing it in detail, but without burdening it with description. And in other words, you're then going to capture a moment where you are in the world, in your handwriting, and you're going to transfer that moment, that feeling, that brief experience to someone else somewhere else in the world, and vice versa. And the whole idea is just to get a little bit of a sense of the richness of these letters, in that they are capturing untold moments we actually spoiled because there's so many of them. And then maybe we can, when you guys have actually received them and exchanged them, we can have maybe 1 or 2 or 3, depends on how many of you participate, have you as kind of guests on a letters from Vincent thing, and read the postcards that you've received, show them and read them. What do you guys think of that? So I don't know how many of you are on Patreon, because you can obviously share your addresses that way. Thanks a lot, Nisi. Nisi says, thank you. This group talked about, what a superb idea. So you can contact one another, I guess, on Instagram or on Patreon or whatever, and then see how that goes. Nisi says, another very special day, priceless as the letters will be. So I just want to orientate you guys with where we are. We are now, the next letter will be 12th of June from Amsterdam. And I think does he spend another year in Amsterdam? 12th of June, 1877. So it actually looks like I made a mistake. I thought that when he went to Amsterdam, he was going to cut loose and start drinking and womanizing, but I think he only did that during his second visit to Amsterdam, which was maybe not even to Amsterdam, to Antwerp, and anyway, after he returned from the Borinage. So I think when he came back from the Borinage, he was like done with certain things, and he was going to take another route. Thank you very much to Donna. Don't know why it's not coming up here. Thanks a lot, Donna Rainey, our new member. Thanks very much. Not there yet says, I hear there's some snow in Colorado. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm going to be doing another episode tomorrow, which will take us finally through Amsterdam, and then we'll be in the Borinage. And I think I don't know about you guys, but I'm looking forward to him becoming the artist. I'm sort of getting a little bit tired of the struggle to be a preacher, which is going to ultimately fail. I'm kind of looking forward to him starting out as an artist. So I kind of want to get there. So we'll see how far we can get tomorrow. I'll probably also try and do an hour or 2. I wonder, Stephanie, do you want to read letters? And that'll also give me a chance to rest my voice and kind of, cut in with commentary here and there. So if you do, let me know. I don't know if there's another member here that would like to do that. But yeah, let me know. Okay, so that's it for tonight. It's just gone past midnight, yet it is pretty cold, wet, and miserable and rainy. I'm gonna am I gonna do it? I was gonna say I'm gonna put up a deep dive number 7 on the Gabby Petito case, but I think the video is going to be quite difficult to edit within the next half hour. So I'm not sure if I'm going to, but I was actually busy with that, which is why I was so late for this. So if you haven't read that post on Patreon dealing with Deep Dive 7, check it out. Someone says they're having a heat wave. Is that in Austria? We have a heat wave here in Austria. Wow, good luck with that. Real Batman, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Okay, guys, enjoy the rest of your Saturday. And I hope to see as many of you in the house tomorrow for Van Gogh Letters number 8. So let's make a date for then. It'll be about the same time. And I hope to see many of you there again, including you, Donna. Okay, cool. Have a good rest of your day and rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.